Well, hello, and welcome back to the YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by Markus and Mark Bilby, and we're going to continue our deep dive into 1 Corinthians. As always, please make sure to subscribe both to the Patristic YouTube channel, but also to Mark's channel, linked down in the description. So, if you haven't already come across this series, please do go back and watch the previous videos on 1 Corinthians and also Galatians to compare the Marcionite version and the canonical version of these two great epistles. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Markus, who will take us away with chapter 11.
Yeah, as promised last time, chapter 11 is a most intricate, a most challenging chapter in the entire letter of First Corinthians. And we just had a big joke when we were reorganizing ourselves here to prepare the session, because we had to match the latest version against an earlier version. And we have seen that most dramatically, the text has been changed. And one of my obsession is to challenge the own assumptions. And so we had a previous text which in any way didn't go through Mark and Lance's checking of the stylistics and grammar and of the lexicography. In addition, I think it became quite clear, as we will see, that it corroborates other views which we have on the Gospel of Marcion. So no longer any ado, we go into the text. As always, we read these two sections row by row. First, we start with the text of the Marcionite from 1 Corinthians, and then we go through it again by looking what the redactors have done with this marvelous text by supposed Paul, at least the Marcionite Paul. Chapter 11. It starts with the head of a man is the anointed, or is Christ. Every man who prays or who prophesies, having a covering over his head, shames his head. But every woman who prays or who prophesies with the head uncovered shames the head of herself. For a man ought not to have the head covered, since he exists as God's image. The woman ought to have an authority upon the head because of the angels. However, neither is a woman separate from man, nor a man separate from woman in the Lord. For even as a woman is from the man, so also does man exist through the woman. There must also be opinions, so that the respected may become visible. For I took from God that the Lord Jesus, on the night on which he was handed over, after taking a cup, after giving thanks, saying, "Take this and divide it among yourselves," and taking the bread after giving thanks, he gave to the students of his, saying, "This is my body." But let a human evaluate oneself, and thus let one eat of the bread and drink of the cup, a judgment on oneself. Now, concerning spiritual things, that's already chapter 12. Yeah, back on chapter 11. So what's the main thrust of this rather short chapter 11? It is first about the relation between men and women, about the people who prophesy, and as an example of that these two are somehow different, at least from the outside. The one has a head covering, the other one doesn't. And interestingly, I'll check the references, but the problem is that we don't have any early evidence whether Jews did cover their heads or not. But it looks like, because that's the oldest reference, and it looks like being here in the Marcionite text as an explicit reference that head of a man is Christ, and that there shouldn't be any covering of a man's head. that this seems to be an antithesis to a Jewish practice. That's what we can gather. Whether that's the case, I think it's an hypothesis which could be right, but must not be right. In the reverse, the woman who prays or prophesies with the head uncovered changes the head of herself. So here the woman is being rather covered. So it's inversion, if you like, of a potential inversion of a Jewish practice. But take it as an hypothesis. Yeah, then we can see this discrepancy between the two is not put as a strict opinion, because he says in the next phrase, when we go a bit further down, but you see, a man ought not have the head covered since he exists as God's image. So there's a strong backing up argument that man should not cover his head, which supposes a practice that men covered their heads. That's why I think the hypothesis has some grounds. And that the woman ought to have an authority upon the head because of the angels. So the difference is that men have Christ straight away, and women have angels in between Christ and their heads. Whether that leads to the idea of a certain hierarchy, a certain patriarchalism, which we can see also in the Marcionite version, which we see in Ephesians, might be the reason for having that kind of a difference. Yeah. And then, however, we have verses 11 and 12, which are not attested, but seem from the lexicography and grammar to be there also in the pre-canonical text. We can see that neither women are separate from men nor separate from women. So they are together, although there is a difference. But as we now see, the difference is being highlighted in the next verse, which states that there are different opinions, but we need to go a bit down. Yeah. So there must also be different heirs. There must be different views or different opinions, so that the respected one may become visible. Now, who is the respected one? I think it differs whether men or women are respected ones. Yeah. So you have a certain division within the community and within the ranks, but these are not divisions in a strict sense, because the divisions between women and men are more the external ones. You might say also the spiritual ones, if you take the angels very serious. But now this Paul takes this kind of a link with differences to explain that difference and the community's link, or the communal version, by looking at what we call the Eucharist. Here it is more the reference to what Jesus did with his Last Supper. So I took from God, he says, that the Lord Jesus, on the night on which he was handed over, which is a clear reference to the Last Supper, after taking a cup, after giving thanks, saying that this, and divided among yourselves. And taking the bread after giving thanks, he gave the students of his, saying, this is my body. So you can see the division is even a division which is related back to what Jesus himself does. He is not putting a body together which is undivided in the sense of unstructured. And yet it is a communal thing. They all get a community with him. But it's not a community of people who are pulled together, but it is a community of differences. And this is not because we are in a postmodern world where everything can happen. It's not because we are deconstructivists, so that no community exists. I think here there is a clear community, but it's a community of people who are different. The ones who are male, the other who are female, the ones without and the other with head coverings. The one whose head is Christ, the other ones who have Christ also as their head, but also have angels in between. What this text will say, I think, from as I read it, is that even with the community with Christ is not without these types of differences. So they're not just all on the same level or just on par with each other. Yeah, then the last bit. But let a human evaluate oneself. And this is clearly a hint that both men and women have to evaluate themselves. And thus let no one eat of the bread and drink of the cup, but as a judgment on oneself. So having this type of community is how to behave towards each other by reflecting on one's own position. That's what this judgment is all about. And the last part, I think, oh, that was already the last part. Yeah. Now, let us look what the redactors have done with this statement, which is predominantly about the relation between diversity and unity, about the position of women and men. As we would have expected it, the redaction starts with a reference to Paul himself. Be imitators of me, even as I also am of Christ, of the Anointed. Now I praise you that you remember everything from me and that you hold firm the traditions just as I gave or have given them over to you. I had an interesting exchange with one of our colleagues today who had submitted a paper for Studia Patristica, which we are editing at the moment. And it is about Serapion of Antioch. So here comes Serapion into the community of Rossos. And he refers exactly to what has been handed over to him par elabomen. So what the tradition is. Now he also sees that the tradition which is being referred to does not refer to any particular gospel. It's more a tradition which he has received somewhere. And he takes that this gospel of Peter that he gets to know in the community of Rossos was perfectly fine. He said, he according to Eusebius, he had a look at it, a short look at it, but he didn't read through it, right? Because he didn't think that it was of any value, of any meaning for him to check a text. That's why I also think that the people who have presented this text to him had no issue with this text themselves, let alone wanted the bishop of Serapion to check any text. It was part of the tradition. But that is around the year 200. So we get the interest in tradition and also in checking texts and reading these texts, different texts, around those times. And our colleague, I think, rightly noticed that Serapion doesn't make any reference and check up of this text of the Gospel of Peter versus one of the canonical texts. They're not even mentioned. Even the fact that this text is a gospel, I think, doesn't make any difference in this text. So we are still in the early days, in those years, towards the end of the 2nd century, where these types of texts were not part of the tradition. But the idea that the traditio, what we have taken on from others, Peter and the apostles are mentioned. So the question of whether Peter and the apostles have an authority, that becomes a more and more important topic, as we find it just a few years earlier in Irenaeus. So it's no surprise that Paralambano is not anywhere in Marcion's New Testament mentioned. On the contrary, you will find it 50 times, just this verb, 50 times in the canonical text. So important the idea of tradition comes to be, and we can see it here. And that's one of the reasons why verses 1 and 2 are not represented in the Marcionite text, but in the canonical one. Yeah, let's have a look further. Now, I wish you to know that the head of a man is Christ, but the head of a woman is the man, yet the head of Christ is God. And you can see the slight hierarchical element that we already find in the Marcionite version, where you have the direct being Christ, the head being Christ the head over men, while a woman have angels above themselves, is here developed on the canonical part into clear hierarchy between men and women, but also in a hierarchy between man, Christ, and God. So we have a full ladder of hierarchical steps which are being further developed. The canonical text takes on board what has been said about women and about their not being uncovered, but they should cover themselves, and they give a further explanation. For it is one and the same as the one being shorn. For if a woman is uncovered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful to be shorn or to be shaven, let her be covered. Which is a pretty strange way of explaining why women should be covered. I think it's a pretty disgraceful one, but that's probably also a more retrospective and anachronistic reading of this text. For on the one hand, the redactors, now taking on back the text from the Marcion version, a man ought not to have the head covered, since he exists as God's image and glory. But on the other hand, the woman is man's glory, which is quite an interesting text. For man is not from women, but women is from man. And man was not created because of the woman, but women exist because of the human. Which of course reminds of Genesis 2 and why and how people come about. For this reason, the woman ought to have an authority upon the head because of the angels. For many, many years, this has always been a struggle to explain, and I think it is even difficult to explain in the pre-canonical version too. But it might be something which one can explain the way I did before. However, neither is a woman separate from man, nor man separate from woman in the Lord. For even as woman is from the man, and also does man exist through the woman, which you can see has a slight tension to what's been said before, when on the canonical side people were saying, for man is not from woman, but woman is from man. But here it's quite clear it's both ways. So I think that was one of the reasons why we left verses 11 and 12 in the pre-canonical text, first because of the lexicography, but also because of that tension which exists in between verses 8, 9, and verses 11 and 12. People have seen that before us. Judge amongst your own selves, is it proper that an uncovered woman pray to God? Does not nature herself teach you? And now comes, as Mark will explain in a minute, a pretty stoic interpretation. Does not nature herself teach you that if a man grows out his hair, it is dishonoring for him, but if a woman grows out her hair, it's glory for her, because long hair has been given to her in place of covering. Now, if anyone seems to be fond of strife, we do not have any such custom, nor do the assemblies of God. Mark, do you want to come in there?
I was going to do a little bit of reading. It's been a little while since I've read Musonius Rufus, but I seem to recall that he has at least a chapter or two in his Stoic philosophical reflections about how men are supposed to grow out their beards and not the top of their hair, and how women are supposed to grow out the top of their hair. And there's just very clear like gender identities about how one tends one's hair, and it seems to overlap quite a bit with the way that the canonical version of Paul pictures it. I did want to bring up one small correction. I'll put it in our chat, but it was 11. It should be not human, but man, actually. I just looked at there was andros there. It's not anthropos. So usually I try to use gender neutral language. Whenever it's anthropos, I try to translate it as human. But in the case of 111, or is it 110?
It's 10.
It's,
yeah, it's
yeah,
10.
11.
It's 9 at the end because of
the end of 9. Thank you. Yeah, it's 9 at the end. That should be man, actually, not human. So, yeah, but that's consistent with the usage that was prior to that. But obviously, it's a gender dichotomy going on, and I think what we see here is there is a gender dichotomy and maybe even something of a gender hierarchy. But the canonical text keeps layering the hierarchy, and it layers the imitation as well. So, Christ is below God, man is below Christ, woman is below man. It turns into a more multi-layered. And then there's a sort of a hierarchy, I'd say, of imitation as well, where Paul imitates Christ, we're supposed to imitate Paul, and so on and so on. So there's you might say like a heavenly hierarchy that's very layered, but then there's also a chronological hierarchy where everything goes back to Paul, and I would say prior to that, to the revelatory historical event of Christ. So it's not just a heavenly, like a cosmological, basic, like dualistic hierarchy, but it's a very layered hierarchical, cosmological and chronological hierarchy that's being deployed by the canonical redactor here.
Yeah. Then we go a bit further down. Yeah, but just one line up, please. Yeah, but in proclaiming this, I'm not praising you because you are not coming together for the better, but for the worse. For first, when you come together in assembly, I hear there exists divisions among you, and I put faith in it in part. For there also must be factions among you, so that the approved may become visible among you. And this is so interesting, because as we have seen, the difference of these heirs with regards men and women, and how they should dress, and whether there should be a cup on, or whether there should be a head covering or not. But here, Paul, the canonical Paul, takes it into factions within the community. And that's why twice the canonical redactors add en humin, among you, as you can see twice in verse 19. So we get to a different form of heiresses. These are not opinions or different school positions. No, here it becomes a diversity within the community. And suddenly the entire narrative about the Lord's Prayer and what it is about divisions and unity becomes a question how to become, or how to get together as a community when they celebrate the Eucharist. So you see a totally different social setting, which derives from moving from a discourse about a particular topic, head covering, difference between men and women, into a positioning of factions within the community. Therefore, in verse 20 is the opening. So now we get to the explanation of how wrongly these people get together. Therefore, when you assemble, it is not to eat the dominical meal. And you can see already a kind of institutionalized form, how one has read the early version of 11:22. For each takes his own meal by eating in advance, and while one hungers, the other is drunk. For do you not have houses for eating and drinking? Or are you disdainful of the assembly of God, and do you shame those who do not have? You can see there is an institutionalized setting which sets the Eucharist up from what's just been mentioned as one reference in 11:22. Here it becomes almost like a set which we can discover in Justin Martyr. We can discover it also in Irenaeus, and we can see it here. So apparently, towards the end of the 2nd century, at least in the second half of the 2nd century, this type of communal meal becomes a ritual which is defined, which has its location, and which has its rules. And those rules are referred to here. Of course, as if Paul in the 1st century had already talked about these type of initial rites or rituals which were already established. And I think that's one of the reasons why people who work on the history of the liturgy have such difficulties, because if these texts of the canonical Paul were from the mid-first century, we cannot explain why the rest of our literature that we have are not displaying this type of Eucharistic ritual until the end of the 2nd century. Are you disdainful of the assembly of God, and do you shame those who do not have? What am I saying to you? Shall I praise you? In this I do not praise you. You can see the canonical Paul, the moralist and the homilist and the teacher of rules. Quite different from the pre-canonical one. For I received from the Lord, it's quite interesting that here it becomes a teaching of the Lord rather than a teaching from God. What I have also given over to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night on which he was given over, took bread. And you can see the different order in the Marcion version. First we have the cup and then the bread. Here we have the bread first. And showing gratitude, he fractured it and he said, "This of me is the body which is for you. Do this in the commemoration of mine." Also, the commemoration is new in comparison to the Marcion version. Similarly, also the cup after dining, saying, "The cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink in the commemoration of mine." Now, it's interesting that the canonical redactors take the new covenant, kaine diatheke, which is the title of Marcion's New Testament, here as an addition into the text. And people have always noticed that this text, as we have it in 1 Corinthians here, 23 to 25 of chapter 11, is so close to the Lucan version that we have in the canonical Luke. The interesting thing, however, is that canonical Luke, the text that we have, comes down to us in at least 2, if not 3 different lexicographical versions. We have almost the identical version that we have here in the Marcionite text, a very short version of the text, also in very old manuscripts. Actually, one of the most interesting manuscripts of Luke is the bilingual Codex Bezae. And in this text, and not only in this text in Greek and Latin, but also in further Latin translations of our old manuscripts like Codex A or Codex O1, but also in other codices and in early lectures. So particularly in the Western tradition, this is the text of Luke, which therefore is also, we think, the text of the Marcionite 11th chapter of 1 Corinthians. Tertullian, namely, says, when he comes to comment on this passage here, that he doesn't need to say any word about the wording, which is different, but because he has talked about this wording already when he commented on the passage in Luke. So he must have seen exactly the same parallelism between this text here and the shortened version that we find in Luke, or rather than Luke, in Marcion's version of Luke. And Marcion's version of Luke, as I just said, is not just a version which Tertullian knows and Epiphanius gives us reference to, but also which we find in Codex Bezae and in the Western tradition. It seems that the canonical redactors have maintained the idea of the parallelism between chapter 11 on the Eucharist and Luke on the Eucharist. Hence, they have made that link at the main, or rather maintained that link, but placed on both sides an extended version, which makes reference to the New Testament in the sense of the new covenant in the blood of Christ. which then is a commemoration. And you can see it is the liturgic guide, or the rendering into a form of liturgy that takes place on the redactional level, both in Luke and also in the canonical Pauline version of 1 Corinthians 11. Having said that, it seems that, if we may say, the older version is Marcion's Gospel and is Marcion's version of chapter 11. Then we have the inverted version of cup and bread. And it is not so much about the Last Supper as it is here being used for introducing the idea of difference and unity of this body. The redactors add to that, and you can see it continues this additional moment of commemoration, which is this liturgical setting now of the Eucharist. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until when he comes. Why is that the text here? Because we have already noticed in the past that the redactors extend the time of the church. It's no longer an immediate parousia of Christ. It is the Eucharist and the ritual which takes place, which is making use of this extension of time until whenever he comes, he will come. But let a human evaluate oneself, and thus let one eat of the bread and drink of the blood. For the one who eats and drinks judgment on oneself by not distinguishing the body. And you can see the idea of that the way I eat and drink here is from making one's own judgment, it's strengthened into a judgment, in a moral judgment here on the canonical level. Yeah, that concludes, I think, with the last section on the canonical version. For this reason, many among you are weak and sickly and considered or asleep. So the moralizing canonical Paul, with his strong judgment about the people, ends the chapter. But if we distinguish ourselves, we would not be judged, but by being judged by the Lord. And you can see this is typically canonical. What was a judgment about ourselves, so that we adjust ourselves, becomes now a judgment by the Lord. And you know, this is one of the standard accusations of Irenaeus and Tertullian, that Marcion's God and Christ is non-judgmental God. And here you have Paul himself, the canonical Paul, stating that people are judged by the Lord. We are being trained lest we be condemned. So this is the last judgment, and no surprise that Marcion was against a judgmental God, because it was such a typically, as he read it in the Jewish scriptures. But here we have it. And when Marcion said that the gospel had been interjected by the redactors by making Christ a judgmental Christ and God a judgmental God, the same happens in the Pauline letters. So let be condemned along with the cosmic order. So then, my brothers, when you come together to eat, wait for each other. If anyone is hungry, let one eat at home. And you can see this topic, which was a canonical topic alone, as the introduction to the whole text. So why is the Lord's Supper's section in chapter 11? It is that we have a disorder between people who eat before and who are satisfied, and other people who are still hungry. This topic is being picked up by the redactors again in these verses 32, 33, and 34, which is absent, not known of, in the Marcionite version, which also gives an indication that the church in the last 2nd century is broadening, is now encompassing people of different social standing, and it becomes a different question, which is being addressed here at the canonical level, and still absent 50 years earlier in the Marcionite version. Which concludes our reading of chapter 11. And yeah, maybe Jack and Mark want to add something to it.
I've been gripped for 35 minutes. I think it might be the first podcast we've had in a long time that I've just kept completely silent because I was gripped. Marcus alluded to it, but I mean, just before we started this podcast, Mark said, "Oh, actually, there's some alterations we need to make to this text because Marcus's reconstruction is changing." And what we did, and I don't know, maybe we should have even shown us to go through this process, but was basically entirely changed chapter 11, the ordering and some of the content. And, you know, I was sort of mesmerized by that to begin with, and have remained for 35 minutes contemplating then the differences and even just that. But I mean, I think that maybe one thing that I would just add is mentioning of this liturgical meal and the perplexing state of affairs in liturgical studies in certainly the first and second century, because I do think, and I wrote an article about this which I'm yet to publish, but particularly looking at the role of bishops, priests and deacons in liturgy and the evolution of those things. And one of the things that I proposed in that was that the reason why we're so confused about why the church hierarchy and church liturgy seems to go backward and forward in terms of what liturgical meals look like is because we have the ordering of the text completely I was going to say arse over tit there, which is what my mum used to say, you know, in the completely wrong order. And when we then use this order, i.e. saying that Marcion is the pre-canonical and that canonical comes later, then actually that smooths out so many of those other questions that our colleagues have about deacons, Eucharist, liturgy, altars, whatever the situation might be. And I wonder whether, you know, the stubbornness of them to accept it is almost a great irony. It provides their own demise, not finding solutions to their questions.
I guess I could chime in here too to say that the canonical text to me reads. I think it's already come across in the description, but you know, the commentary really is that we have a much more refined, rarefied liturgical sensibility in the canonical text. It feels much more like a sacred meal, almost an ordeal that one has to be very cautious around because it could bring judgment, and that it's not really a meal in the sense of eating. When I read the Marcionite text, it seems to me that could still be an actual meal where people are getting together, breaking bread, eating. But in the canonical version, you're not supposed to come hungry to this meal. You're supposed to eat before you even go, because it's not a meal. It's a ceremonial, purely ritual thing. It's an encounter with the sacred, and it's not simply the community getting together to share a meal. And not that it's not commemorative in the Marcionite version, but it's just much more clearly a commemorative ritual. Marcus brought up that word commemoration before. In liturgical studies, we use this the particular Greek word, anamnesis, which means remembrance or commemoration or something like that. One might even say reenactment. So in the canonical text, one reenacts the Passion, one might say, in the Eucharistic meal. Where in the Marcionite version, there's clearly a Eucharist, but I'm not seeing sort of highfalutin ceremonial language or really strong historiographical language, or it's just a much simpler narrative as I read it.
Maybe we should have a short look back into the text and to see what is the indication that we have Eucharist already there. Have a look. So because we first have only the indication about the debate about head coverings, and difference and unity. So this is head covering, prophecy, and people, So when people are together, of course, they prophesy, both men and women, and the discussion which is indicated here and the unity and difference is about how people have to dress by covering or uncovering or not covering their heads. That's what it is when they got together to have prophecy. So there's a ritual where people gather and where prophecies are being exchanged. Now, okay, women ought to have and man not. carry on. And for that indication, when people are together, there is reference being made to how Christ picks up a cup which is shared and which is divided, so people can take from it. Yeah, wait, just this is where we have the opinions, so the respect becomes visible. And now comes the reference, which gives support to the idea, yes, we have difference and unity. But you can see from here, as before and afterwards, there is no single reference, but we can carry on with the text. So let humans evaluate oneself, thus let one eat of the bread and drink of the cup, judgment on oneself. If and we might discuss that together, whether 28 was in the Marcionite version or not. I had serious doubts when I reconstructed the text, whether 28 should be taken out. But after discussion today, I think we need to change our reconstruction here as well. Mark, I mean, your job is, again, to fiddle out and to see what the lexicography says and what the grammar says. But from the discussion and from what you were saying and interpreting how to interpret this text, I think maybe 28 wasn't there. Because if we take our 28, which is not referred to by our witnesses, the text would read, just we need to see the content before. So if this text in 23 to 25 is the backup that there is division and unity, and that the judgment is on oneself, which refers not to then 28, but refers to what we've had before, that people shouldn't judge, or if they judge on themselves. It's about head covering. Then 28 goes. And in that case, which in my view makes a lot more sense, there is no reference of a Christian Eucharist in chapter 11 of 1 Corinthians. So the practicing is not to be related to the Marcionite community. And that would mean that the practice of a Eucharist is an introduction on the canonical side whenever that verse 28 and the other verses were altered. So as you can see, now this is live, yeah? This is live reconstruction. This is live discussion. We are not yet to release the data. We're still working on it. And what you get in this video channel is how we work and how we are working at a proper reconstruction of these texts. And you will see in the final product how chapter 11 will look like. So we first have to go back to the drawing board with regards to this question. We cannot decide it today. And I'll be surprised what Mark and Lance are getting back to us with their computer results.
And if you didn't already need a reason, there's reason to subscribe to Patristica to find out what's going to happen. It's like a series on Netflix that you just don't know the answer to yet, partly because we don't know the answer.
Exactly.
As always, please also subscribe to Mark's channel, and we do really appreciate all of your support. And until next time, have a good one. See you soon. Bye-bye.